All right, welcome to another Ask Octopus. This is a normal distributed edition. We're no longer all in Brisbane together. So, as always, I'm Ryan Russo, and I've got Bob and Derek with me. Say hi, guys.
Hello.
Hi, guys.
All right. So, just to recap, this is a weekly video series where we take questions from the community and we give you some sort of answer. So, I'm going to kick off the day with this question that we actually got as a comment on our first video. Which is, what is delta compression? How does it work? And can we disable it or enable it? Like, how can we control it? Which I think delta compression is actually one of those features that maybe a lot of people don't know about because it's just kind of there and it usually just works. And if you don't actually go into the logs and look for it, or you don't read the doc page on it, you may not know that it's actually working in your benefit.
Yeah, I saw it pop up in my logs every once in a while, but I really didn't pay a whole lot of attention to it. And I learned a little bit more about it when we started working here, obviously, but it's kind of exciting to learn a little bit more today.
Yeah, I remember when it was released because I was like, oh, that's like handy because it's going to like cut down the time of my releases. So yeah, I'll just like talk about that for a second. Like, what is delta compression? So basically what Octopus will do is if you're deploying a new package to one of your targets, if it's a supported target type, the Octopus will say, oh, you've got this old version of the package already on the target. I'm just going to make a delta. I'm going to do a diff of those packages, and I'm only going to send the diff to your target. And then Calamari on the other side will reconstruct the full package from the previous one and the diff. So it can save you some time on the transfer if it creates a much smaller package, and it makes your process go a little bit faster.
That makes sense because typical day-to-day, you're not redeploying the entire application. You're probably making a change here or there, maybe to a HTML file or to a JavaScript file. You're not.
Yes. Yeah. If you're only like, maybe you've only rebuilt your binaries, but all your HTML is static, or all your assets are static and they haven't changed, then that can be a huge benefit because then your delta may be very small. And I've got a few examples. I created some. I went to the wrong slide, and then I just created some examples of what does it look like in the log. So where would you go to find out whether delta compression is working for your project, and what to look for? So the first thing I did was I went to our demo OctoFX project, and I just downloaded the package and made a single change to the web config. So if we drill down into acquire packages, and it was the trading website one, you can see that I incremented the version number. But if we go into the logs, you'll see that it's found a matching version for the previous version. And then it's going to build a delta. And then you can actually see a few lines down. It actually says that we only got a 0.33% size reduction. So this is not a good delta. And this is an important point. The reason it is like that is because I created the package from my local computer instead of the build server that was, created the original package. So all the timestamps on the files had changed because of they're set to the download date or the extraction date.
Okay, so it looks at the dates. Does it look at anything else when it comes to the files?
I don't know everything it looks at. That's the main one
Okay.
I know about and that was actually a problem when delta compression was first released for me, because my build process would create a brand new package every time. I wasn't doing incremental changes. I was wiping out the package folder completely, building everything from scratch because I didn't want any random artifacts getting in, like people get in, add stuff, change stuff, or maybe things that had been deleted but now it's still in the package folder. I was creating a new package every time, so delta compression actually didn't do anything for me in the initial release until I changed my process. But yeah, so that's the main thing. So any artificial changes to the files will cause it to see them as different. I know on our docs page, it does recommend using like our tools, either OctoXE or OctoPack, to create the packages because it's got some optimizations built in to try to avoid those things. I don't know exactly what it does. I don't know if it's like modifying the files to make sure that if the contents hasn't changed, it doesn't like copy over the timestamp, or I don't know exactly what it does. I just know on the docs page, it does recommend using those tools to avoid any potential artificial differences.
So
Gotcha.
Ryan, Ryan, this would really benefit people when transfer time is like really long and really critical to the deployment.
Yeah, especially like think of your package, like these are small artifacts that we're deploying. It's only 5 megs, but you can imagine 100 megs, 500 megs. If you have a huge package that you're deploying, if you can get a delta that's a fifth of that size, it's going to transfer much faster.
Yeah.
The second line that we actually see is that because it was more than, or it was within 80% of the original size, it's not going to upload it. So Octopus will automatically say like, oh, the delta we created is too big. Anything 80% or more, we're just going to upload the full package, because otherwise you're going to upload the delta, which is almost the same size, and then you've got to do work on the other side to recreate the original from the previous and the delta. So you're doing extra work. It would actually, some cases, take up more time to do that. So we automatically, if it's 80% more, or it's 80% or more, we won't, we'll go ahead and just push the package instead of the delta.
That's really good, because I mean, ultimately what will happen there is this is actually, as much as the delta compression will help things, like you were saying, this is going to have really good end results, but it's also a sensible approach. So it does some built-in checks.
Yeah. So what I actually want to jump into now is I went through and I created another package based on the one I uploaded. So now we can actually see what it looks like when you only change one file in a package. So we'll see now when it creates the delta, we get a 99.95%. Now that's a very a very artificial example. Like I added a DAP setting to the web config. So yeah, it's going to get a very small delta. If you're just changing but if you're only changing a few binaries, or maybe your web config, or maybe a few HTML files, you should see a pretty good size reduction. And that's another thing we mentioned in the docs is if you're not seeing, so this is something like it's owned by default. If you go check your logs and you see that you're only getting like a 50% size reduction or less, like if it's pretty close to that 80% like threshold we have already, you may want to disable delta compression, because you may not be because it's got to do work on both ends for that. It may be faster for you, especially if your targets are all within this the same network as your server. You may not actually be getting any benefit. So we can go ahead and disable that. And the way you do that is through a project variable. So you can set a variable for octopus.acquire delta compression enabled, set that to false. And then when you do another deployment with a new package, what you'll see is this message of skipping delta compression because it's been disabled. So that is delta compression in a nutshell. Yeah, it's very useful, especially if you're pushing out to different networks and you've got those settings in place to where you're not, your packages can be reduced. The delta would be very small, or a lot smaller than the original package. You can save on some bandwidth and some transfer time there at the expense of building it on the other end. So you do have to build that package on the other end. So it's one thing to look at. If you have it, check and see if it's enabled for you, check and see if it is actually giving you any benefit, and disable it if it's not.
And that would have an impact on the CPU as well, wouldn't it?
Mm-hmm. Building the package on the Calamari side is very CPU intensive. So that's another reason they say it's if you're not getting that much benefit from the streaming part, then it's probably good to disable.
Awesome.
And we'll put in the video notes, we'll put a link to the documentation where you can find out even more about delta compression. And I'm going to turn it over to Derek now.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Ryan. Okay, that ties actually in quite nicely with what I'm going to be discussing today. I'm going to be discussing about part one of common performance issues. We see, with the customers, I'm sure you guys see it as well, you often do see performance issues. What tends to be happening is it really just depends on, often it's just a case of forgetting to set something up. Do you guys get that much?
From time to time, yeah, I'll get performance issues come through, which is nice because we've made a ton of performance improvements to the product in the last year. A lot of times it's, hey, I can point you to this bug that was, or this GitHub issue that was fixed in, 2018.6 or 2018.9. And it's just an upgrade. We'll fix that performance issue.
Yeah. One of the first customers I talked to, they had some pretty significant performance issues. They were one of the reasons why we had to really focus on actually making performance a big thing, a big goal that we wanted to accomplish last year. So yeah.
It
was kind of a trial by fire at that particular point.
No, it's obviously one of my biggest customers as well. It had huge performance issues, and there is no real silver bullet. It's just the first thing that I would always recommend is upgrade. It's key to really anything. It's particularly last year where we made a lot of performance improvements. Where possible, get to one of our latest releases in 2018 version 11 and in 2018 version 10.1, our long-term support version. There is some serious performance database performance improvements, and really that's one of the things. One of the first things is upgrade. Please, where possible, try and keep something within the past 3-4 months. There are a lot that we're continually testing our performance and making it better. And it's funny, some of the other things tend to be a bit more common sense. For instance, separate out your Octopus server and your SQL. It's something I see pretty often, more often than I actually care to admit. And what also, some of the things that you can do are scaling your tasks. By default, Octopus ships with 5 enabled. It's real more safety by default. So you can come in and change that. And one of the key things is our retention policies. I'll just show you that. Within lifetime, yeah.
Oh, Derek, what's like a good number? I know it depends on your hardware, but like, what do you think an average number? What do most people set their task count to?
To be honest, I generally see 10. 10 tends to be a pretty solid average. I've saw where it tends to be. I've saw up to 30. What sort of numbers are you guys seeing?
I've seen 20 recently, and then I think I see anywhere from like 5 to 10 usually. I don't think some people don't necessarily go in and change that setting.
Yeah. 5 to 10 is pretty common with me. I saw one customer, they have it up to 100. And I was like, wow, that works for you. They have a lot of resources dedicated to that box, because really at some point you're just going to kind of run into, there's only so many network connections you can open. There's only so many CPU cycles you can use. It doesn't matter how much power you throw at the box. There's just a finite number of resources. So I don't recommend going to 100. I think 10 seems to be a pretty good average between 5 and 10.
I generally find that's good. At that point, you tend to find that when you're really doing things at scale, 20 is where I think as well it does help. But that, again, similar to what you're saying, generally has a higher. There's ways to approach that. But you would need a high CPU, high memory, etc. And one of the key things that I see all the time is retention policies not being set. What we often see is, this is a little Derek demo lifecycle, real basic. I'm not actually using it anywhere, but what you can see here is within the lifecycle, what you can actually do is you can set your default retention policy. So in this instance, I've went for 3 releases locally and 3 releases on the Tentacle. You can select days, but where that falls down is when you have something that you're only releasing. Say, for instance, if you set it to a week and you're only releasing it once a month, then don't obviously set that up. But one of the things, and what this does is this actually filters down to, it makes it the default. So as you can see here, you've got your 3 releases in locally on the server and on the Tentacle. And then what I've actually done here is overridden. You can actually override the retention policy. In this instance, some people may choose to set it so that it's a production retention policy and then reset for dev and test. But I've went for mainly because dev and test I like to keep really light, and 3. And 3 does tend to work quite well. I'm not saying obviously that doesn't work for everybody, but where possible, one of the things is this actually deletes your release, obviously after say 3 releases or 10. And what it does is that has a big impact on the database, because what it'll do is it'll go in and it'll clean up those items in the database and keep your database nice and small and compact. Because that's one of the things is it does, and this actually ties into the next one is SQL maintenance. I'm not going to talk about it in depth just now, but just make sure that you have a maintenance plans in place. And there's Ola Hallengren has some really great stuff there. I'll add that into the links as part of the Ask Octopus session, because he tends to have a really great approach, and it really keeps things nice and lean and well, and keeps defragmentation down. But that's one of the things with our newest releases, we have built in a check where it checks for the level of defragmentation, and if it goes above a certain value, it will automatically defragment it, I've saw some really big improvements. So yeah.
But that only runs when you do an upgrade. It doesn't continuously run. It's just a one-time thing where we'll go through and defragment your indexes or rebuild your indexes.
Well, that's where you do need to look at, database maintenance. And whereas, if you do have a DBA, I would always recommend talking to your DBA to get, the best possible performance. But yeah, that's pretty much it for today's. I'll go through another session another time where we talk about scaling and additional things. So over to you, Bob.
Before we start over on me, one thing I did want to bring up is that with retention policies, if the release is being used by a dashboard, so to speak, it won't remove that release. It's not going to delete the release or anything like that. So
if it's still in the dashboard, it won't be removed. So that's a really good
and that's a complicated statement, because it's usually the last 2 releases per environment, but also throw tenants and channels in there. Those extra dimensions. So it's really, if it shows up on any dashboard, for whether it's the main dashboard or the project overview, and that could be just, you've got 1 channel, no tenants, then it's the last 2 per environment, and then multiply that or add in any channels and tenants you have. So if it shows up there, it won't be deleted.
I've ran that query to determine if a release shows up on a dashboard, and I think it errs on the side of caution, so it will include more releases than it probably should at sometimes. Other times it does a really good job. It really depends, like Ryan said, all the different points, the environments, the channels, the tenants, everything like that. It seems to be it works out really well, but every once in a while you'll notice, like, hey, why wasn't this one particular release removed? Well, it's because the query thought it showed up on a dashboard.
Yeah, and the retention policies are a good point, Derek, because just like the delta compression, its own, like the default is maybe something nobody looks at. They just set up a life cycle and they just leave the default settings. The default is keep everything. So it's something that someone may not have looked at if they haven't adjusted the settings.
Yeah, well, it's safety by default. You want to keep everything. You don't want to be deleting things without really knowing what you're deleting. And in some instances, a keep all is required. You may find that people who have got high regulation may have to, but obviously it will slow down a little bit eventually. But with a well-maintained Octopus SQL database, then you can minimize the impact there as well.
Nice.
Absolutely. Okay. I'm going to jump over, and this was a question I actually got this week that made me think about previous jobs I worked at, believe it or not. How can I use Octopus Deploy to refresh production down to UAT? So this was actually something that I ran into at a previous job where production was always it was constantly changing the data. We'd have so much data. And before we went to do a deployment to production, there was always that concern, because man, this has so much data. Can we make sure that it works when we do this deployment, especially around my SQL scripts, everything like that, or doing performance testing and everything like that. So the company that I worked at, we would monthly basically shut down our UAT environment, and then we just refresh everything down from production. We'd run a number of different cleanup scripts to make sure all the sensitive data was scrubbed, but really it was the volume of data and the type of data, because it was just almost impossible for us to kind of reproduce that in a very common or controlled testing environment. It would just be impossible with the number of different possible edge cases. Did you guys ever run into something like that at previous jobs?
A whole bunch. A whole bunch. It was, I worked with Psycho a lot. Generally, code was going forward, content was coming back. So like that, you had to plan it. You obviously shut down UAT, for instance, for a day. Thankfully, the code base tended to be pretty easy to deploy, but the database was really, database deployments, it kind of crashing down. And I was never able to do it because what you'd have to do is go in, refresh the database, rebuild all the indexes. And so definitely appreciate that one.
Yeah, we had something similar. We actually had some SQL jobs where you, like for each UAT or support environment, where you could just like run the job that would refresh the data, scrub it. So that was actually pretty nice. The where it fell down was like, oh, now you have to make sure the web code is the same, which once we implemented Octopus, then that problem was solved. So that was good. But it's like not just for UAT though. It's like also important for keeping our staging or our pre-prod. Like you want those to be as close to production as possible. So it's nice to have that in place.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the specific question was more around they were like, how can I re-trigger a deployment in Octopus Deploy for the most recent release to say a UAT or a staging environment? I kind of took that to the more, I'd say, crazy conclusion than what they were asking. But in the end, it was kind of more of a motivation thing. It's like, hey, if I was still working there at this particular job, how would I actually solve that using Octopus Deploy? So let's, I'm going to jump in. Let's make sure, and let's get out of there. So I have a couple of applications that I'm particularly worried about. So when we did a refresh at the company that I worked at, it was really just the database that we were really concerned with. The code, we were fine with the code. We could just leave the code at. We weren't trying to refresh the code because it was always, it'd always be like the latest release or anything like that. Did you guys kind of have that same thing where it was really just the database you were concerned with?
Yeah, for the most part. And then you would trigger the job to refresh the database, and then you'd go and trigger a deployment in Octopus to refresh the web code.
Yeah, it kind of got a little annoying because you're always constantly, every time we would turn back on our UAT environment, it was just a big cluster because we had everybody just trying to re-trigger all their database deployments at once. And we had the requirement where a DBA had to approve a release to the UAT environment. So it was just like, man, we just got inundated with, like, they would have like 55 requests that could come through in about a minute. I'm like, oh my gosh. So I have a couple of these. I have two projects that I'm concerned with. So I have the OctoFX database and our random quotes DB. And then what I did is I'm going to kind of walk you through what I set up. First thing I wanted to do is I wanted to set up a custom lifecycle. So I set up a custom lifecycle called, Restore from production. So unlike every other lifecycle that I have where I go testing, staging, production, or I do staging, production, this one's going backwards. I'm doing production, and then it's going to go to staging first. And so every release from production has to be successful. It sounds a little crazy, but hopefully it makes a little bit more sense in a bit. The other thing that I did is I came in here and I created a user called redeploy user. And you'll notice that it's a service account. That's what that little icon means. I gave it an API key. And so that user is assigned to a role that has deployment rights to basically redeploy to staging. So those were the initial kind of scaffolding things that I had to set up. Then I'm going to go back to my dashboard. And now I added in this, what I call my template project. Now, this is something that I couldn't do until workers came out. And I'll show you why. Because I'm going to do a backup of the database, but I'm going to run everything through the database worker pool. Then I'm going to restore the database going through the worker pool, sanitize the data, and then I'm going to redeploy that release to staging. In the past, I would always have to pick some sort of target. So everyone would kind of be just all over the place, like where we would try to run this particular work. With workers, it kind of is nice because I can consolidate it all down and have it be like a single process, I guess, to define for this. And then for here, I have a bunch of variables that I'm actually going to be passing in. So for sanity's sake, what I do is I make these prompted variables. So if anyone were to try to run this project, they would get prompted and say, hey, what do you want to do? And so I gave it a number of different variables. That way I can do That way I can just send this kind of information down. And I'll show you how I did that in just a sec. So then finally, what I have here is I have this restore from prod step. And this is taking advantage of our deploy release. So I'm saying, hey, I want you to deploy backup restore application, deploy it every time, and then I want you to send in all of these various variables down to it so it can handle all these different things. Hopefully that makes sense so far.
Yeah, that's really cool. I was going to say this process that you've built, the way it looks on screen, it looks like a really good use case for maintenance processes.
Yes, it does. Yeah, creating a release every single time was not really fun last night. But I'm going to go back to this dashboard because I did want to show you this one last step, this backup restore application inside of here. This is a script that I'll include links in our description on how to get to this script because this is a custom script that I wrote. And what it does is it will go through and it uses the API and it'll rip through and it will find the most recent release to staging for that particular application. Because what I was doing initially was I was like, oh, I'm going to try that deploy release step. Well, that worked, but it would constantly find, so I'm going to use this as an example. So I have release 1.0.2. When I did the deploy release step, it was trying to pull 1.0.2. What I wanted to do is I wanted it to pull 1.0.1 because that was the most recent successful release to staging. So I was like, oh man, I can't use that.
One thing I'd note about those scripts, it looks like because we are on the latest version, you've got the space ID in the queries. So anybody who's not on 2019.1 yet, my numbers all jumbled, 2019.1 would have to modify those slightly, just remove the space ID basically.
Yeah, and that's why I'm just going to include a script. I'm probably going to upload it into one of our public example repositories. That way people can download it and they can modify it as they see fit because I have a feeling everyone's particular use case is going to be slightly different.
Right, yep.
We'll be constantly doing that. So what I'm going to do is, and I had one last thing that I wanted to show is because it's a service account, I want to walk through this process really quick. So I have this approved deployment and I have it going to staging. And what I did is I set up a run condition that said, only run this when I'm doing a manual deployment. And I set that variable in this auto approve redeploy. And what this is this is another step template that I put together. And what it will do is it'll basically check to see if the user is, I can expand this out just a sec. It checks to see if the user is a service account and if they're active. And they're the one who created the release. So basically what it will say is, hey, the user who created this release is a service account. So it's going to auto approve that deployment to staging. So it kind of solves that problem of having to trigger all these extra deployments.
That's pretty cool.
So I'm going to do I'm going to actually trigger this. And so I'm going to create a new release. Let's go ahead and deploy this.
We get a lot of questions that have themes. Like I know just in the past week, I've done some work that had related to those conditional, like manual approvals and conditional run conditions. Like that pops up a lot.
Yeah, and it's interesting to kind of solve that particular problem. And I guess a lot of people don't realize that, you can just run a PowerShell script at the very beginning to kind of set a variable that will make some of those run conditions make a little bit more sense. I was going to say, you answered that question a while back on one of the first couple of videos, right? So we can maybe link to that in the notes too. Yeah. And I like doing the PowerShell script. The main reason I like doing that is because then I can have a lot more business logic inside of there, so I can make some other decisions rather than trying to have if-then statements in my variables themselves.
Yeah. And what's nice is you could pull that. I mean, you had it inline, but there's no reason you couldn't pull that out into a package and then source control it and then have that saved away.
Absolutely. All right. So I did my deployment to production, which kind of felt a little weird to start out with production. And then all it does is it's just going to run that worker. And then if I view the deployment itself, it just did a backup of the database. And then so it saved that backup. I'm going to go ahead and deploy this to staging. Okay. So I'm going to go back to the dashboard because I think it's kind of fun to watch because you should see pretty quickly this staging is going to refresh. Yep, there it goes. So now it's doing the automatic deploy. So I click in here and you'll see right here, auto approve redeployment. and we can go into the worker. It says, oops, up there it is. The user created this release. It's a service account, so it's going to auto approve that. So now it just ripped right through and did everything. So it automatically just skipped that approved deployment step for us.
That's awesome. I'm guessing as well as, you could extend this and bring it all the way back to dev.
Oh yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's no reason to have it just restricted to just production staging.
Yeah, that's going to help database, automatic database deployments as well. It's going to, obviously it standardizes everything back to what's in production. So that's definitely going to help people who are doing database DevOps.
Yeah. And the other reason I kind of like this idea is because the customer I was talking to, they had a PowerShell script that they kind of put together. But the reason I like this is because you can control the order a lot better, at least visually, as to what apps run first. So what apps get backed up and restored first, what apps get redeployed first. Because as I've discovered, at some of the larger companies, they have a lot of they might have some dependencies that they don't know about. Like, hey, this app or this database has to be deployed before this database can be deployed, or anything like that. So you can really control the order in which all this work is done.
Yeah, I gotta love hidden dependencies, right?
Yeah, you don't know about it until like you run your app and staging and everything fails on you.
Yeah.
All right, yeah, that was basically a nutshell of everything that I did. One thing that I was thinking about, and you'll have to really decide if this is a process that you're going to implement. One thing you have to decide is whether or not you want to enable maintenance mode while you're doing this refresh. So that way you don't have any deployments going to staging that are legitimate deployments, I guess. That's pretty easy to enable. You just come in here into maintenance and you just say enable maintenance mode. And what maintenance mode will do is if you are an administrator, it will allow you to make deployments, but otherwise you can't.
Yeah, and you could even add that to the process. The first step could be turn it on maintenance mode, and then the last step could be turn it off.
Yeah,
that may be. Yeah, that would really be up to somebody's preference whether they'd want that to happen or not. Because I could see switching in and out could be annoying, but it's a safety factor too. So
yeah, absolutely. So yeah, that, believe it or not, when I automated my Octopus upgrade process, and that was one of the first things I figured out how to do through the API was enable maintenance mode. So that's actually a really good point. That would be a good thing to add into that process. All right. So that's all we had for today. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.